Yeah, I think that's one thing that has changed, Bob. And Bennett has been through some of the great challenges in political history in the state, having to run against David Duke, who ran against Russell Long. He never ran against. I never ran against him. He against me. But that was the kind of intense feeling for a guy who was literally, a Nazi practically, and if not truly. And yet, he'd go to these rallies and cite these crowds, which was just crazy. But Bennett survived that, and it wasn't easy.
The that sentiment that you were just describing that you met in Shreveport was taken onto the House floor earlier this year when Joe Wilson shouted at the president, "You lie." Could either of you imagine that ever happening when you were there? And if it did, what would have been the consequences for someone who did something like that officially? And how would his or her colleagues have treated that person who did something that outrageous?
Well, the Senate, when I got there, was a very different body from the way it is now. I mean, it was relatively nonpartisan. There was no such thing as the wedge amendment. A wedge amendment is a cleverly worded amendment not meant to pass into law, but rather to create the substance for a 30-second spot. Like they want to take so much money from this and give it to crippled children. So that even though it might be the wrong thing to do to take money from LSU to give to crippled children, you would have to, you didn't want to be seen as voting against crippled children or some other worthwhile cause. That didn't come in really till Jesse Helms came into the Senate, and he created the wedge amendments. Then the Democrats learned to do it as well. So now you have about half the things you vote on in the United States Senate are wedge amendments. But it was much more civil. Still, even today, you wouldn't find that kind of "you lie" in the Senate. But it is not as friendly and as warm and cordial as it used to be.
And I think Ben is absolutely right. And I think one of the reasons, and Chris having been in the Congress, a lot of the members now in the Senate that have, I think, contributed to this different atmosphere, which is very bad, are former House members that came over from this House, and they had grown up in this atmosphere of extreme partisanship in the House. And then they got elected to the Senate, and they brought that same culture over to the United States Senate. And I think they've taken the Senate down a large degree because of this mindset that they brought from the House. And one of the differences is the structure of the government. I mean, the House was intended to be the people's house, and it was intended and structured to be very regimented. And you could only speak for 3 minutes or 2 minutes or even 1 minute. And if you were in the minority in the House, you were in the minority, which meant you didn't get to do nothing. You were never a chairman of a committee or a subcommittee. You may not even be able to offer an amendment because the Rules Committee would not let you even offer an amendment. And you were completely, totally shut out. They would do conferences without any House members that were in the minority. They wouldn't even tell them where they would meet. So if you're in the minority in the House, it was a bad place to be, as opposed to the Senate, which, one senator can stop the whole train through the filibuster rule. You got to get 60 to stop it. And so you necessarily in the Senate were forced to compromise and work together. And Democrats had to find out what the minority Republican would want, or the majority Republicans, when they were in the majority, had to consult with the Democrats, otherwise the minority could stop it. In the House, the minority was not like they weren't even there. And so when you have members who grew up in the House, then come to the Senate and they try to make the Senate like the House, you see the Senate now starting to act like a lot of what was happening in the House, which is not good for this country.
You made the point earlier, Senator Rowe, that it hasn't always been all that civil in Congress. That some of these developments aren't new. And I was thinking about Charles Sumner, the senator from who got caned on the House floor, bludgeoned to an inch of his life in the 1850s, and so it goes way back. And then I was thinking about what George McGovern told me when I was interviewing him for one of my books about how he gave a speech on the Senate floor about the Vietnam War in which he went out of his way to try to offend his colleagues, to get them to think about what they were doing. And he regarded confrontation and sort of that incivility as a way to prod them into thinking about an issue in a different way. And so I'm wondering, are there times when confrontation and that kind of dialogue do serve a purpose and are appropriate, or do you take the position that it should never drift into that kind of incivility?
Well, the Senate rules prevent that. You're violating the Senate rules. Actually, you're not supposed to address, I should not even say Senator Breaux, I should say the distinguished senator from Louisiana. And people violate that rule all the time, but they cannot speak ill of another senator. If so, you can make a point of order and that senator can be made to sit down. Which is not to say that you can't have some very spirited, that is to say, tough debates where people get just mad as the devil and do it, you might call him the distinguished senator, but say it with a sneer on your face and put other words in your sentence that let him know that you don't think much of him. But nevertheless, the rules of the Senate do prevent that sort of thing. And indeed, in the House, Joe Wilson was violating the rules of the House by what he did as well.
I think one of the points